It started with a 2 a.m. notification, one I'll never forget. My account had been emptied, over $36,000 gone. But what shattered me wasn't the money. It was what my dad said when I asked why. You owe us. That was the moment I stopped being their fixer and started being my own protector. If you've ever felt like your love was turned into obligation or your success used as a family lifeline, stay with me. This isn't just about betrayal. It's about boundaries. And the day I chose mine, even if it meant losing them, it started with a vibration against my nightstand. At 2:14 in the morning, my phone buzzed once, just once, and lit up the room with a glow that somehow felt more threatening than helpful. I picked it up groggily, expecting maybe a weather alert, maybe an email. What I saw instead knocked the air clean out of my chest. Negative $36,842.19, not pending, not held, gone. I stared at the number like it might rearrange itself if I squinted hard enough. I closed the app and reopened it. I held my breath. I blinked 3 times, my heart racing, hoping this was one of those weird sleep paralysis dreams where nothing makes sense, but you can't wake up. But it was real. The money was gone. The air felt heavier. The walls of my apartment, once cozy, now seemed to lean in on me. That number on the screen might as well have been carved into my chest. My name is Vivian Lowell. I'm 30 years old. And that night I learned what betrayal looks like when it wears your last name. I hit call on my father's number before I could even think it through. He picked up after 2 rings on speakerphone as usual. I could hear jazz music playing in the background, upbeat, energetic, almost taunting. Then came a woman's laugh. My mother's. Doreen. Dad. I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Something's wrong. My account's drained. My card's maxed out. Over $36,000 is missing. There was a pause. Then his voice as nonchalant as if I'd asked about the weather. You're always so dramatic, Vivian. I froze. Dramatic, I echoed. That's my savings. That's my rent, my taxes, my emergency fund. That's everything I've worked for. He sighed like I was the inconvenience in this story. The family needed help. Your mother's surgery wasn't covered. Tyler's truck gave out again, and the mortgage was a month behind. His tone was matter-of-fact, like he was reading off a grocery list. Why didn't you ask me? I managed already knowing the answer, but asking anyway. That's when she chimed in. My mother, ever the sharp tongue dipped in sarcasm. Oh, please, she said with a chuckle. What were you gonna do with it? Buy yourself cake and candles? You can celebrate alone this year. We had better plans. My jaw clenched, not just because of the words, but because they said them so easily. No guilt, no shame. Like this was normal. Like this was love. I didn't give you permission, I said, voice flat. You don't need to give us permission, my father snapped back. You owe us. After all we've done for you, we raised you, fed you, clothed you. For that, I whispered, I gave you birthdays, holidays, hospital bills, student loans, car's rent. For that, I gave you everything. Exactly, he said, almost triumphant. Because that's what family does. I sat there in silence, my phone pressed to my ear, listening to the music in the background and the hum of entitlement in their voices. They had used my money without asking, justified it with their version of love, and now they were offended. I was upset. I wasn't angry yet. I was stunned. This wasn't a crack in the foundation. This was the entire house collapsing around me. And so I made a decision. Then don't ever call me again, I said softly. And I meant it. I ended the call. My apartment was suddenly too quiet. No music, no voices, just me, the dark, and a phone screen that still read negative $36,842.19. But in that silence, something clicked, something subtle and cold and clear. They didn't think they stole from me. They thought they were entitled to me, my time, my income, my labor, my loyalty, my peace. They thought I was an extension of their needs, a bank account with a pulse, a resource, not a daughter. I sat on the edge of my bed staring at nothing while a single thought repeated over and over like a slow-growing drumbeat in my mind. No one asks for access to what they already think they own. It wasn't the money that broke me. It was the casual way they took it, the confidence in their voices, the certainty that I would absorb the blow again, but they were wrong. That night I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I got out of bed, walked to my desk, opened my laptop, and pulled up every account that had my name tied to theirs: banking loans, insurance, utilities, even streaming services. Because I may have been their daughter, but I wasn't their lifeline. Not anymore. After I ended the call that night, I didn't go back to sleep. I sat on the floor of my living room, wrapped in a blanket that still smelled like lavender detergent and something resembling safety. My laptop hummed softly beside me, still open on a spreadsheet of everything my name was tied to: mortgage, loans, joint accounts. And then, as if pulled by a thread I hadn't realized was still connected, my memory took me back to the first time I understood what it meant to carry weight that wasn't mine. I was 12 years old the first time I felt responsible for keeping the lights on. It was early December and the air in the trailer we lived in had a sharp bite. I had come home from school to find my mother Doreen sitting on the couch with her face in her hands, shoulders shaking. She wasn't the type to cry in front of me. Usually she saved her tears for when it earned her something. But that day she didn't notice me standing in the doorway. The electricity bill was overdue, again. The shut-off notice was already posted to the door with yellow tape. She whispered almost to herself, "I don't know what we're gonna do." I remember walking to the small mirror near the kitchen and seeing my own reflection, 12 years old in a hand-me-down hoodie, teeth slightly too big for my face, and eyes already learning to scan for danger. The next afternoon, without telling anyone, I walked into the hair salon 2 blocks from my school and asked the manager if she needed help. I offered to sweep hair and take out trash. I told her I was saving for a birthday gift, for my mom. She smiled and gave me $20 under the table every Friday. That $20 paid the electric bill that month, and that was it. That was the moment the roles reversed. Quietly, without anyone announcing it, I had become the backup plan, the contingency, the child turned parent. Back then, I wore the title like a badge. I thought it meant love. I thought taking care of them made me good, made me worthy. I thought that maybe if I did enough, they'd never leave again. Because that was the unspoken truth my dad had left twice before always coming back with a suitcase and a new excuse. And my mother. Her love was like a loan with interest, sweet in the beginning, suffocating by the end. That first job turned into others: babysitting, tutoring, waiting tables in high school. I paid for my own school supplies, my own winter coat, and sometimes theirs too. I got my first credit card at 18, and by 19 it was maxed out. But not by me. There was always a reason. We just need a little help until Friday. You're the one with good credit, sweetheart. We're family, aren't we? By the time I turned 24, my name was on the mortgage of a house I didn't live in, the cosigner on my brother Tyler's student loans, and the emergency contact for a woman who once left me home alone for 3 days with a box of cereal and a note that said, "You're a smart girl." I was smart, but not about them. I believed that love was supposed to be hard, that loyalty meant silence, that being good meant giving more than you had. And they knew that. I looked back at my phone and pulled up an old text. Christmas morning last year. Doreen had sent it right after I covered 3 months of their car payments. "You're our miracle, Viv. We don't say it enough, but you're everything this family needed." Back then, those words had made me cry. Now they felt hollow, like wrapping paper over a vacuum, like someone saying thank you after robbing you. What they really meant was, "You're convenient. You're useful. You're the resource we don't want to admit we've drained." I had confused being valued with being used. I had mistaken need for love. I wasn't their miracle. I was their lifeline, and not the emotional kind, the financial one. And I had bought into it year after year, birthday after birthday, thinking maybe this year would be different. Maybe this time they'd see me. But the truth was clear now, as clear as the negative balance in my account and the laughter in their voices when I told them what they'd done. They didn't love me for who I was. They loved me for what I could provide. And worse, they expected me to keep providing, because I had for so long. But that night, wrapped in that lavender blanket surrounded by account passwords and contract numbers, I understood something I had never allowed myself to say out loud before I had been raising them since I was 12. I was the responsible one, the reliable one, the one who didn't fall apart, the one who covered, the one who fixed. And that version of me, she was exhausted. I closed the text. I closed the spreadsheet. I stood up and looked at my own reflection again, this time in the dark glass of my living room window. Older now, tired, but clearer. I had given enough. And tomorrow, I would start taking it back. By morning, I had a plan. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't about teaching anyone a lesson. It was surgery. Clean, sharp, necessary. I started with the mortgage. It was a house I never lived in, never slept a single night under its roof. But my name was on the papers because my parents' credit was too damaged to qualify. At 25, I'd signed the dotted line, thinking I was helping them build stability. Now 5 years later, I was the one carrying their broken foundation. So I picked up the phone, called the lender, and asked to begin the process of foreclosure. The woman on the other end sounded startled. "Miss Lowell, are you sure I was?" Within an hour, the process was initiated. The home that had drained my savings, my credit, my peace of mind, it was no longer mine to protect. By noon the next day, Tyler's truck was gone. The tow company didn't hesitate. The bank had flagged the loan after I submitted evidence of unauthorized charges. Screenshots, statements, timestamps. They reviewed it, asked no follow-up questions, and acted swiftly. I watched from my car parked 3 houses down as the flatbed pulled up in front of my childhood home. Tyler came out in pajama pants and no shoes, yelling, arms flailing. I didn't stay to watch the rest. I didn't need to see his face. I already knew what it would look like. Shock, then betrayal, then blame, because in our family responsibility was a one-way street. Mine, but not anymore. I drove away without turning on the radio. The silence in the car was thick, but it didn't feel empty. It felt earned. Back home, I moved on to Brittany, my little sister, the golden child. I had co-signed her student loans 2 years ago when she wanted to find herself at a private liberal arts college that cost more per semester than I'd made in my first full year of work. At the time, she had promised, "I'll take this seriously. I'll pay you back the minute I can." She never did. She went to Spain for a semester abroad, bought a new iPhone, got matching tattoos with her roommate. The loan company didn't ask many questions either. Co-signing is a delicate bond. But when I explained that I was under financial duress due to misappropriated funds by the primary borrowers, they offered a solution, a hardship clause that allowed me to withdraw. I signed the documents without a second thought. Brittany would have to reapply with someone else, or maybe for the first time face the consequences herself. Each of these decisions was a clean slice. No shouting, no tears, just precision. They had made the mistake of assuming that because I was quiet, I was weak, that because I rarely argued, I would never fight back. What they didn't understand was that silence isn't the absence of power. It's often where it begins. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was responding, with action. People think boundaries are loud. Mine were quiet. People think ending a cycle requires confrontation. Sometimes all it takes is a signature. I paused at one point, standing by the window watching the light shift on the hardwood floor. I tried to remember the last time I made a major decision without checking how it would affect them. I couldn't. Every vacation I skipped, every upgrade I postponed, every bonus I diverted, it had all gone toward maintaining their comfort, their illusion of control. And every time I had told myself I was helping. But helping without consent becomes obligation. And obligation without acknowledgement becomes resentment. I wasn't their fixer anymore. I was their firewall. And unlike a fixer, a firewall doesn't negotiate. A firewall blocks what threatens to destroy. That evening, I poured myself a cup of tea. Nothing fancy, just something warm to mark the day. My phone buzzed once, twice, then again and again. Missed calls. From Mom. From Tyler. From numbers I didn't recognize but instinctively knew were them using someone else's phone. I didn't answer. I didn't even look. Instead, I opened a new document on my computer, typed the word boundaries in the header, and started making a list. Not for them. For me. A firewall doesn't just keep people out, it also keeps you in. And for the first time in my life, I was inside my own protection. Secure, unreachable, safe. By the following morning, the storm had begun. It started with a text from my father. "Vivian, the house is locked. What's going on?" Then another from Tyler. "Where's my truck?" I woke up and it was just gone. "Did you do something?" A third came from my mother, less direct but no less accusatory. "Sweetheart, the bank says our mortgage is in default. This has to be a mistake." They came in waves after that. Texts, missed calls, voicemails. First confused, then annoyed, then frantic. I watched the screen of my phone light up like a pinball machine. I didn't pick up. I didn't answer. I didn't even open most of them. I wasn't being dramatic. I was being deliberate. For years, I had lived in a state of emotional triage. Patching, fixing, covering, apologizing. I had become fluent in family emergencies. I had learned how to be useful before I ever learned how to be free. But not this time. This time I wasn't rushing in. This time I wasn't the safety net. This time the silence was mine. Instead of responding, I logged into every digital doorway they might still have access to, my online banking bill pay portals, my email accounts. I changed every password to something long and unreadable. I turned on two-factor authentication for everything. I called my credit card companies and told them to flag any suspicious activity. I froze my credit through all 3 reporting agencies. It took 2 hours to secure my digital life. 2 hours to build walls they couldn't scale. I wasn't doing it out of spite. I was doing it out of necessity. Because boundaries I'd learned aren't always about confrontation. Sometimes boundaries are just quiet exits from rooms where you're no longer safe. By noon, the tone of their messages had shifted. My mother's texts became sharp. "You're being selfish, Vivian. We're your parents. You're blowing this out of proportion. You've always been too sensitive." I smiled not because it was funny, but because it was familiar. The script, the gaslight, the subtle inversion of truth where their choices became my fault, and my reaction became the real betrayal. But I didn't take the bait. Not this time. I didn't need to explain myself. Let them rage. Let them shout into the wind. They didn't know this version of me. Because the old me, the one they were trying to reach, was gone. The old me would have rushed to explain, to smooth things over, to find a way to make everyone feel okay again. The old me would have answered every call, written out her reasons in paragraphs, tried to help them understand why she was hurting. But that version of me had died sometime between the $36,000 they stole and the moment they laughed about it on the phone. This version of me wasn't fueled by anger. She was fueled by clarity. And clarity has no need for permission. I made tea and sat by the window while the phone kept buzzing. I watched people walk their dogs on the sidewalk below. I watched the sun shift across the rooftops like nothing had changed, and in a way nothing had. Except me. I didn't turn off the phone. I didn't throw it across the room. I just let it ring. It was strange how peaceful it felt. Watching their words come in like digital tantrums while I did nothing. No explanations, no pleas, no rebuttals, just silence. A silence they didn't know how to navigate, because for so long I had been the one who folded first. When they got loud, I got quiet. When they were cruel, I was patient. When they crossed the line, I moved the line. Now I was still quiet, but for a different reason. Before, silence had been survival. Now it was a shield. Before, I fixed things to keep them close. Now I didn't need their proximity to validate my worth. I picked up my journal and wrote down a sentence that had been swirling in the back of my mind all morning. They're not calling because they miss me. They're calling because they lost access. And that distinction made all the difference. It wasn't me they were mourning. It was the resource I had become. The fixer. The helper. The one who always came through even when they didn't deserve it. They missed the lifeline, not the life. I put down my pen and looked around my apartment. Small, quiet, fully mine. No voices echoing through the walls. No guilt circling overhead. Just me and the quiet hum of a new boundary settling into place. That night, I turned my phone face down and went to bed early. Not to escape, but to rest. Because even though the world outside was shouting, I had finally stopped listening. It started with the doorbell. Not just once. Not politely. It rang in bursts frantic and sharp, followed by a pounding fist against the wood. I didn't need to check the peephole to know who it was. I sipped my coffee instead, the steam curling lazily toward my face as if it had all the time in the world. I cradled the ceramic mug in both hands, its words etched in faux gold lettering, Ba Wan daughter, a gift from 2 Christmases ago. Cheap, sentimental, ironic now. Outside, my father's voice bellowed, Vivian, open this damn door. We need to talk. Then my mother's high-pitched and cracking with forced emotion, please, honey, just listen. This has gone too far. I didn't respond. I didn't move. I sat at my small dining table, sunlight spilling through the sheer curtains, watching dust swirl in the air like snowflakes. The contrast between the calm inside and the chaos outside felt like poetic justice. For once, I wasn't the one spinning in anxiety. They were. Vivian, this is your family, my father barked. We raised you. I wanted to laugh. That word, raised, they always used it like it was leverage. As if providing the bare minimum of food and shelter in exchange for obedience was some noble sacrifice. As if I hadn't been parenting them since I was 12. 10 minutes passed like that. Knocking, yelling, pleading, threats. My phone buzzed on the counter voicemail, after voicemail piling up. I didn't touch it. Instead, I stood up, set the mug gently in the sink, and walked to my laptop. I opened my inbox, found the thread with my attorney, and started typing. Subject: immediate action required. Hi, Michael. Please proceed with full disassociation as discussed. Revoke all joint access. Remove my name from any shared titles, utilities, or services still pending. Also send me confirmation that the financial power of attorney we granted them 5 years ago is now officially void. Thank you. Vivian Lowell. I hit send. The final cut. The kind of detachment that doesn't make noise, doesn't leave blood. Just a clean severing of paper and permission. It felt like closing a chapter or burning one that should have never been written. Then one by one I logged into the accounts that had kept me tied to them in 1,000 invisible ways. Netflix, cancelled. Amazon Prime, cancelled. Spotify Family Plan, removed their access. Utility bills for the house they lived in, but I paid for, transferred to their names, or scheduled for disconnection. My mother's medication deliveries, unsubscribed. Their cell phone plan, migrated to solo accounts. If they wanted to keep their numbers, they'd have to call the provider themselves. Every click was a small exhale, not from satisfaction, but from release. I wasn't cutting them off out of spite. I was cutting myself free. It's a strange thing how many ways a person can be tethered to people who only show up when it benefits them. And stranger still how long it takes to realize that every little convenience you cover, every automatic payment you forget to notice is a quiet way of saying, I'm still here, even when you're not. Well, I wasn't there anymore. Eventually, the doorbell stopped ringing. The fists stopped pounding. But my parents' voices carried through the door like ghosts, who hadn't realized they were already dead in my story. You're ruining everything, Vivian, my father shouted. We trusted you. My mother cried. I didn't respond. I made another cup of coffee instead. A new mug this time. Plain white. No inscriptions. Just mine. They stood outside for another few minutes, whispering to each other now, maybe realizing I truly wasn't going to open the door. Then slowly they left. I watched them through the peephole as they walked away. My father red-faced and pacing my mother in a leopard print cardigan, sobbing louder than the doorbell ever was. It should have hurt. It didn't. Later that night I checked Facebook. I shouldn't have, but curiosity has a way of creeping in when you're finally calm. My mother had posted a status update. It's always the ones you love the most who hurt you the deepest. No tags, no names. Just enough breadcrumbs for her friends to rush in with support. Oh no, Doreen. What happened? You raised her too soft. She owes you everything. Each comment felt like a pebble thrown at a wall I had already bricked shut. A year ago, I might have written a long reply, explained my side, defended myself. This time I just turned off the screen. Because when people only love you loud in public, but drain you in private, they don't deserve access to either. I sat back on the couch, the evening quiet wrapping around me like a blanket. For the first time in years, I felt unhooked. Not from them, but from the belief that I had to prove anything to them. They were knocking on a closed door, and for the first time, I didn't need to explain why I wouldn't open it. 1 week of silence. 7 full days without a single ring of the doorbell, no texts, no cryptic Facebook updates. It was quiet enough that part of me wondered if they had finally accepted the boundary. Not understood it, perhaps, but accepted it. Then came the voicemail. I didn't see it until late afternoon. The alert on my phone blinked softly while I watered my plants. I didn't recognize the number, but the area code was familiar. I let it go to voicemail without hesitation. Later, when the sun dipped low and the kettle whistled softly on the stove, I sat down with my tea and pressed play. It was my mother. Vivian, it's your mom. Your father. He fell. He broke his leg. Badly. We're at county, but they won't do the surgery without a down payment, and we don't have insurance right now. We know you're upset, but this is serious. This is family. Please, just call back. I sat still for a long time, not crying, not angry, just still. I knew that tone. I knew the carefully measured panic in her voice, the kind that held just enough desperation to sound urgent, but never quite enough accountability to sound sincere. This wasn't the first emergency. There had always been some form of it: the unexpected medical bills, the overdue loans, the just until Friday moments. They'd come in waves for years, each time wrapped in the ribbon of family obligation. But this time, I didn't rush to my wallet. Instead, I opened my laptop and clicked on the folder titled History. It was where I had kept digital records. Screenshots of overdrafts they'd caused, receipts of payments they never repaid, emails where they'd authorized charges in my name, photos of their vacation while I paid their overdue rent. I scrolled slowly. The birthday they forgot, but charged a dinner for 4 to my card. The cash advance they pulled without telling me, labeling it a gift when confronted. The overdraft alert at 2:14 a.m. still bookmarked at the top. Each file was a small betrayal, taken alone, maybe even forgivable. But lined up like this in rows and folders and timestamps, it became something else entirely. A pattern, a system, a blueprint for how they had used me again and again. I closed the laptop. I could afford the surgery. That wasn't the issue. I had enough in savings, enough in credit, enough in patience if I really tried. But I didn't have enough self-abandonment left in me. I had bled for them for decades. And now they were calling again, holding out their hands with a wound that wasn't mine, but hoping I'd still bring the bandages. I didn't. Instead, I pulled out my checkbook and wrote a check to myself. Pay to the order of Vivian Lowell, amount $5,000. Memo Peace Fund. It wasn't about the money. It was a statement, a vow, a redirection. Every time they had taken from me, I had paid. This time, I paid myself. I folded the check, neatly slipped it into a blue envelope, and tucked it into my desk drawer. A small, quiet act of rebellion, of healing. The next morning, my cousin Elsie texted me. Viv, is it true? They said your dad's in the hospital and no one can reach you. I stared at the message for a moment before typing back. Yes, I know. She replied within seconds. They're saying you're being cruel, that you don't care. I waited, then typed slowly, deliberately. Tell them I hope he heals, but I won't bleed again to fix their wounds. There was no reply, just 3 dots. Then nothing. I set my phone down and looked out the window. A light breeze moved through the trees, and for the first time in weeks, I felt it. Not just the wind, but the stillness beneath it. It didn't ache anymore. That familiar tug in my chest. The guilt, the reflex to explain, to fix. It had quieted. I didn't need to prove I cared. Because I did. I always had. But caring doesn't mean carrying. And love, when it becomes a leash, ceases to be love at all. That night I slept with the window open and no phone by my bed. No alarms, no late-night messages. just the hum of peace growing slowly finally inside my own skin. The morning of Alana's wedding felt unusually still. The sky was overcast as if the universe had muted its color palette in quiet respect. I stood by my bedroom mirror, holding the black satin dress against my body, breathing in the weight of what the day meant. Not for the bride, but for me. I hadn't seen my parents in person since the day they stood on my porch, yelling through the door I refused to open. This wedding wasn't a reunion. It was a test. A moment to reclaim space without explanation. Alana was one of the few people in my life who had never demanded more than I could give. She had always seen me without asking me to justify who I was. We didn't speak often, but when we did, it was always real. Small words with big meaning. She'd been there during the quiet times when no one else noticed I was unraveling. I slipped the dress on slowly, the black satin hugging my form like a second skin. I didn't choose it to make a statement, but it made one anyway. I wasn't mourning anything, not a family, not a history. What I wore was my own reclamation, of power, of peace, of personhood. It wasn't about loss. It was about autonomy. When I walked into the reception hall, the hum of conversation dipped slightly. People glanced, did double takes, whispered behind napkins. I held my posture steady, eyes forward, feet anchored. I wasn't here to cause a scene. I was here to be unshakable in a room that once would have unmade me. I spotted them almost immediately. Doreen, my mother, in a lavender sheath dress that fit too tight around her arms. Her lips were painted in a shade too young for her face, and her eyes darted between tables as if scanning for familiar power. Beside her was Russell, my father, stiff in his rental tux, gripping a cane he may or may not have needed. His face wore the same blend of confusion and entitlement he'd always used like armor. I took my seat at the far end of the room, away from the family table. Alana had placed me with her friends, people I didn't know but who didn't know me either. And that in itself was a kind of freedom. I didn't have to be anything except present. There were no expectations in their eyes, no questions hiding behind polite smiles, just clinks of glasses, shared laughter, and stories about things that had nothing to do with family drama. It was beautiful. For the first time in years, I danced. Not because I was trying to prove something, not because I was filling a role, but because I wanted to. My feet moved without guilt, my smile stretched wide and honest. I wasn't bracing for impact or scanning the room for approval. I was living. Halfway through dinner, I saw her walking toward me. Doreen. She moved slowly, deliberately, wine glass in hand, expression unreadable. As she reached my table, she placed her hand on the back of my chair the same way she used to when she wanted to assert control in subtle ways. "You look different," she said softly, almost like a compliment. I met her gaze steady and unflinching. "I am." She hesitated, the weight of my answer hanging between us like a curtain she didn't know how to pull back. "I just wanted to say," she began, but I raised a hand, gently interrupting her. "I'm here for Alana," I said. "Let's leave it at that." Her face didn't crumple. It didn't soften. It just changed. Like something inside her shifted slightly, but not because of reflection, because of recognition. For the first time, she understood I wasn't hers to manage anymore. She walked away without another word. My father never approached. He looked at me once across the room during a toast, raising his glass, in what might have been an attempt at a gesture of reconciliation. I didn't raise mine back. I simply looked away. Forgiveness wasn't something I performed anymore. It wasn't a toast. It wasn't a handshake. It was the act of withholding permission to be harmed again. It was peace with a boundary, not a reunion. When the first dance started, I sat beside the cake table watching Alana swirl in the arms of her new husband. She caught my eye once, smiling, and I smiled back. She didn't need to ask how I was. She could see it. After the music softened, she came over and slipped her hand into mine. "I'm so glad you came," she whispered. "Thank you for making space for me," I said. She nodded, and we didn't need to say more. As the night wore on, I watched my parents from a distance. They mingled with relatives, laughed too loudly at jokes, and avoided looking directly at me. And yet, I could feel their energy orbiting mine, waiting, hoping, for something to pull us back into old gravity. But I wasn't caught in their orbit anymore. I had become my own planet. When the last song played, I gathered my things without fuss. I didn't hug them goodbye. I didn't linger. I didn't explain. I left quietly on my own terms, heels in hand, heart intact. And outside, under the string lights that lined the path to the parking lot, I exhaled so deeply, I thought the night might take it and carry it away forever. I was no longer the lifeboat, and for once I wasn't trying to keep anyone afloat. I was simply walking on my own 2 feet, free, whole, untouched. The morning of my 31st birthday arrived like any other Tuesday. Quiet, unremarkable, wrapped in a soft gray sky that felt more like a blanket than a mood. I woke to the sound of light rain tapping against the window pane, not an alarm, not a phone call, not even a vibration. There were no birthday texts, no voicemails, no rushed apologies or guilt-laced. We didn't forget messages. The silence from my family wasn't loud anymore. It didn't echo like it used to. It was just still. And in that stillness, I finally understood something I had never allowed myself to believe before. I didn't miss them. I missed the idea of them, the version of family I used to dream of. Supportive, safe, warm. But the people who shared my blood had never been that. And a year of distance had shown me how much of my life had been spent trying to edit reality into a story it never was. So no, there were no flowers on the doorstep, no birthday card with love mom and dad scrawled across the bottom in rushed pen, no cash slipped into an envelope with a passive-aggressive note. There was nothing, and it was everything I needed. I moved slowly through the morning, brewed coffee, lit a candle that smelled like cedarwood and oranges, played Nina Simone on low volume. I wrapped myself in my favorite sweater and sat by the window watching the city breathe. It wasn't loneliness. It was clarity. At noon, a soft knock interrupted the quiet. I hesitated, old reflexes tensing inside me like strings about to snap. But something about the knock was different. No pounding, no urgency. Just a simple, steady rhythm. I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. It was Alana. She stood there in jeans and a raincoat, hair slightly damp, holding a bakery box in both hands. Her smile was small but real. When I opened the door, she didn't say happy birthday. She didn't make a big show or start singing. She just held out the box and said gently, "I figured you'd rather have something sweet than something loud." I laughed before I could stop myself, and something loosened in my chest. Inside the box was a small vanilla cake with cream frosting and a single candle nestled in the center. On the corner, in soft pink lettering, it read, "Just breathe." I didn't know what else to write, she admitted. But I figured, you'd get it. I did. We sat in the kitchen, the lights low and the rain still whispering outside. She poured 2 glasses of oat milk, and we didn't say much. We didn't need to. After a while, she reached across the table and placed her hand on mine. Her palm was warm and familiar. "You were never the problem," she said. "You were just the first one to leave the fire." I didn't realize I'd been holding my breath until then. We lit the candle together. No singing, no countdown, no clapping, no wishes, just air, just presence, just the kind of silence that healed, not harmed. We leaned in, counted silently, 1, 2, 3, and blew out the flame. The room dimmed for a second, and I swear, I felt the moment settle around me, like a hug made of breath. For the first time in my life, I didn't make a wish. Not because I didn't believe in hope, but because in that moment, I had everything I needed. I had peace. After dessert, we sat on the floor and shared childhood memories that had nothing to do with pain. She told me about her first crush. I told her about the time I tried to dye my hair red and ended up with pink-orange streaks for 3 months. We laughed like we hadn't done in years. Not carefully, not cautiously, but fully. Before she left, Alana pulled out a tiny envelope from her coat pocket. "It's not a gift," she said. "Just something I wrote." Inside was a handwritten note. "May this next year be soft, where the last was sharp. May your boundaries hold like bricks, and may your heart grow moss instead of scars. You are not alone. You just made it out first." She hugged me tight. No words, no pressure. Then she left. And I stood in the doorway a moment longer watching her umbrella bob down the sidewalk, swallowed slowly by the mist. I turned back inside, closed the door, and leaned against it. I looked at the quiet apartment. The flickering candle wick, the empty cake plate, the folded note on the counter. This was my family now. Not in blood, but in bond. Not in obligation, but in intention. No calls, no messages, no desperate knocks. Only peace. And peace, I had learned, is not always something you find. Sometimes it's what's left when you finally stop giving everything else away. The apartment was quiet. Not the kind of silence that comes from absence or loss, but the kind that feels chosen, cultivated. The kind of silence that doesn't ache anymore. It breathes. I sat by the window, the same one I used to press my forehead against on harder days and let the afternoon sun warm my face. I watched the shadows shift across the floor, watched people pass below, their lives unfolding with no knowledge of mine. It felt good. To be invisible to the world but deeply seen by myself. A year ago, this stillness would have made me uneasy. I was used to living on edge, waiting for the next call, the next crisis disguised as a request, the next favor labeled as family. But there had been no voicemails lately, no snide texts, no overdrafted credit cards, no sudden emergencies where I was expected to drop everything and come running. And that was the point. I had stopped showing up where I was only valued for what I could give. I picked up the journal I kept on the side table and flipped back through the pages. The ink had faded slightly, but the emotions hadn't. I saw myself in those scribbled lines, tired, confused, hopeful. I could still feel the echo of the girl who wrote them. The girl who at 12 years old watched her mother cry over the electric bill and thought, "This is my fault to fix." The girl who swept hair after school while other kids played outside. The girl who co-signed loans before she even understood interest rates. The girl who paid hospital bills she didn't incur, kept the lights on in a home she didn't live in, and answered every call with, "Of course I can help." And somewhere along the way, that girl became a woman who finally said, "Enough." I set the journal aside and opened my laptop. The screen blinked to life, familiar and soft. I clicked over to my personal blog. Not one with thousands of followers or curated photos, but a quiet space I kept for myself. A digital clearing in the woods where I could lay my thoughts down without performance. There was only one new post that day. Just one sentence. Letting go of people who don't value you isn't selfish. It's how you choose to live. I stared at it for a moment. Simple, clear, true. No grand declarations. No clever metaphors. Just truth. It took me 3 decades to realize that walking away doesn't mean you failed the relationship. Sometimes it means you finally honored yourself enough not to keep bleeding for people who treat your kindness like currency. Sometimes choosing peace means choosing distance. Sometimes love doesn't mean reunion. It means release. I clicked publish. The screen refreshed with the tiny confirmation, "Your post is live." And in that moment, I felt something shift. Something internal, quiet, but undeniable. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I wasn't just recovering. I was rebuilding. Not a version of my old life, but something new. Something that belonged solely to me. I stood up, stretched, and walked over to the kitchen. Made a fresh cup of tea. Added honey just the way I liked it. No one to comment. No one to interrupt. Just me honoring small comforts. On the fridge, I'd pinned a note I wrote to myself a few months back. One I saw every morning. "You are no longer the resource. You are the reason." It reminded me daily that I wasn't here to be extracted from. I wasn't a backup plan, a fallback, or a fixer. I was a whole person. I sat back down with my tea and looked around the room. There were no reminders of them anymore. No shared bills, no unpaid debts, no tension buzzing under the surface. Just books I loved, art. I'd picked out myself, plants that I'd kept alive with my own hands. My own joy, my own rhythm. There were, of course, memories. But they no longer held power. They were shadows behind a closed door, real but no longer reaching. And I finally was not reaching either. Because this wasn't just a story about cutting people off. It was a story about coming home, to myself. I had spent years trying to earn love I had already given freely. Now I understood that love is not proof of loyalty when it's only returned in desperation. It is not selfish to say, this far no further. It is survival. It is self-respect. It is liberation. As the sun slipped lower on the horizon, casting long lines across the hardwood, I picked up a pen and scribbled one last note in my journal. Before closing it for the day, I am no longer theirs to explain, to manage, to mold. I smiled softly, because I wasn't. I was mine. Fully. Finally. Freely. If any part of Vivian's story felt familiar to you, if you've ever been the one who gave and gave until there was nothing left, if you've had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your self-respect, then you're not alone. Have you ever had to walk away from people you loved, just to finally love yourself? Share your story in the comments. I read every single one, and this space is for all of us who are learning to choose peace over guilt. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next chapter in our collection of healing boundaries and rediscovering your worth. Because sometimes letting go isn't the end, it's the beginning.